Bonjour tout le monde, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen. Bonjour tout le monde et merci d'être venus si nombreux, malgré le temps qu'il fait dehors, à cette soirée axée sur les questions relatives à la propriété intellectuelle dans le contexte de la ronde de négociations sur le renouvellement de l'ALENA, actuellement en cours cette semaine ici à Montréal. Hello and welcome everyone to this evening's very timely and important discussion on promoting creativity and innovation in the NAFTA negotiations. That's not promoting creativity inside the negotiations. It's promoting creativity as a result of the negotiations. Just to be clear, thank you so much for being here, especially given the filthy weather. My name is Brian Lee Crowley, and I'm the Managing Director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, the #1 think tank in Ottawa and one of the top few in the country according to the University of Pennsylvania's annual International Think Tank rankings. Before I go any further, please let me take a moment and acknowledge the presence with us in the room today of our Montreal board member, Pierre Casgrain of Casgrain et Compagnie. Pierre est un membre énergique et super positif de notre conseil d'administration. Il me fait toujours plaisir de l'accueillir à nos différentes activités. Un gros merci, Pierre. To return to our work at MLI, I'm exceptionally proud to say that our Aboriginal work was shortlisted this year for the prize for the best think tank project in the world. And an issue we have taken a keen interest in recent years has been the role of intellectual property in unlocking both innovation and prosperity. As you all know, we are at this moment near the very heart of some particularly tense negotiations as part of the latest round of NAFTA talks. And I'm sure we can all agree that there is a great deal riding on the outcome. And while there is so much media focus on the politics of trade and the stormy rhetoric that accompanies it, it's certainly gratifying that so many of you are obviously interested in the substance of the negotiations and the policy impact of the decisions that our leaders will make. We're here to discuss how best to protect the work of those innovators and creators who are so vital to economic prospects on both sides of the border. As we will hear from our speakers, intellectual property law and trade are closely connected. Countries trade better when they respect one another's property. Harmonization of intellectual property rules is shown to improve trade levels and facilitate both international joint ventures and licensing, as well as foreign direct investment. We need to have confidence in the treatment our copyright and patent holders will receive in foreign markets, and they need to have that same confidence in us. The Government of Canada, in my view, sadly, has been deeply ambivalent about using these and other trade negotiations as a platform to improve the quality of IP protection at home, mistakenly thinking that Canadians benefit from weak rather than strong IP protections, and seeing calls from our trading partners for improved IP protections as somehow a concession to be resisted rather than an improvement to be embraced. It was especially ironic then to see the Government of Canada, in the person of the Royal Canadian Mint, recently recognizing the benefits of strong IP protection for its own innovation, as was the case in the front page story in the National Post on Saturday about the Mint's decision to sue its Australian counterpart for patent infringement in a new kind of coin that they produced in Australia. But what is good for the Government of Canada is good for all Canadian innovators. From the new medicines we depend on for improved health and increased longevity, to the modern creative industries such as video gaming, to genetic modifications in agriculture, new ideas must be fostered and nurtured. The consequences of a failure by our two nations to agree to keep updating and advancing the rules that allow innovation to thrive would be severe. And I think that by the end of this evening's program, we'll all have a better sense of what's at stake. Just for your information, the program will proceed as follows. We'll have 3 short talks by eminent experts, whom I will introduce in a moment, who are all sitting up on the stage. That will be followed by roughly 20 minutes of Q&A with full audience participation. We'll then wrap up the formal part of the meeting, or the evening, and there will still remain a good 20 minutes or so of reception, allowing more exchanges between you, the audience, and our guest experts. To begin, let me ask my dear friend, Scotty Greenwood, CEO of the Canadian American Business Council, to bring a word of welcome from the council. Scotty, please come up.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. Bonjour tout le monde. Il est un grand plaisir d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui. Thank you so much. Congratulations. I didn't realize best think tank in the world. That's amazing. Donald Trump will be tweeting about that shortly. Congratulations on that.
It's huge, huge.
We're always pleased to see your important work of you and the MLI. So thank you so much. Canadian American Business Council is about convening dialogue. It's such a pleasure to have Blair Dickerson from Rio, who's on our board, is here. David Short from Federal Express is here. Phil Levis from Washington, D.C., from Pharma. And a brand new member, Donna John, is here. So we're delighted to have our members here. We also want to congratulate Action for Trade, Josh, for your incredible work. And how smart is it to release a poll on the day you do this event that says, 73% of Americans agree with your point of view? I think that's great to lead with that. And anybody that's in the media that hasn't seen the crosstabs on that poll, I think you should ask Josh for them, because that's a pretty good way to start the NAFTA week. That having been said, the only thing standing between you and this panel and the hockey game later. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the conversation.
All right, let's get down to it. I'd like to introduce the key contributors to this evening's event, starting with Josh Teitelbaum. Josh is here representing Action for Trade, whom Scotty just mentioned, and of course Action for Trade is our partner on this event, and we're delighted to be working with Action for Trade on this wonderful event, which was their idea, and they put it up to us, and we thought it was fantastic. So they've been a great partner for MLI on this event, and they've been instrumental in bringing us all together this evening. And prior to his current successful legal career, Josh worked on trade policy with the U.S. Department of Commerce and made major contributions to the Obama administration's highest international trade priorities, including the development of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Before that, as an advisor to members of Congress, he helped navigate the passage and subsequent implementation of the Affordable Care Act. And Josh is going to take a few minutes to talk about some of the issues we're concerned with this evening. Josh, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Scotty. I will speak precisely half as long as both of you, since it will be in English only. The French is less than non-existent. So thank you both. Anytime you have the opportunity to work with the best think tank in the world, you jump at the chance and say yes. So thank you again for your partnership in hosting today's event. It would not exist without the great work of MLI and your team. So thank you very much. Absolutely. I want to thank all of our speakers as well, in particular Richard Owens and former Congressman Dr. Charles Boustany for your insights. Look forward to hearing your thoughts on our topic today. My name is Josh Teitelbaum. I'm with Action for Trade, a new coalition dedicated to advancing a pro-creativity and innovation trade agenda. Action for Trade's members span the creative and innovative sectors of our economy and include trade associations and companies in technology, biopharmaceutical manufacturing, and content publishing and creation like authors, recording artists, and movie and television companies as well. The diverse coalition actually came together very quickly last fall because we all saw the same urgent need, which is that the debate in Washington about trade did not reflect the full activities of so many segments of our economy. The fact of the matter is that the creativity and innovation-based industries that our membership represents accounts for faster economic growth and greater job creation and exports than our industries that are not IP intensive. In fact, creative and innovative industries support 58 million American jobs. That's nearly 40% of the American workforce. And they add jobs at 7% faster than other industries that are not IP intensive. In other words, we are a large and growing segment of the American economy. Our members agreed that if we wanted to change that debate and ensure that a modernized NAFTA promoted creativity and innovation, that we had to take action. We have been engaged with policymakers in the administration and on Capitol Hill since the very beginning, and I'm glad to see some of them here tonight. Thank you so much. Today we took another step to inform that debate As Scotty mentioned, we released a poll today. The top line information is on the tables in front of you in both English, French, as well as Spanish. I wanted to take tonight's opportunity to briefly highlight some of those results with you. So we conducted an online nationwide survey of 1,986 registered voters in the United States, conducted by Morning Consult from January 11th through January 14th, and found a couple of important statistics here. Voters, number one, overwhelmingly recognize the importance of innovation and creativity for job creation and economic growth. 90% of voters believe that innovation and creativity are key to creating jobs. But there is a gap between what most Americans believe their free trade agreements should do to create jobs and what they believe they actually do in practice. Nearly 2 in 3, 63%, say U.S. trading partners currently undervalue American innovation. And American voters believe that free trade agreements and NAFTA in particular should be updated to close that gap. Well, how? 3 in 4 believe that Canada and Mexico should pay a fair market value for American medicines and medical cures, for example. And 3 in 4 believe that a modernized NAFTA should strengthen protections for copyrights and intellectual property. What's clear to us from these numbers, and you can see the full results on our website at actionfortrade.org, is that there is broad support for trade agreements that promote creativity and innovation across a diverse set of American demographic groups. So as I mentioned, please head to actionfortrade.org for the full results. You can look at the crosstabs, as the polling industry refers to it. You can see that breakdown by party registration, by gender, by age, and the results are really nearly unanimous in its support for the promotion of creativity, innovation and creativity in free trade agreements. So now I am very excited to really give the floor to our other speakers, and I'll let Brian introduce those. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Josh. It's now my pleasure to introduce my friend and collaborator at MLI, Richard Owens. Richard is a Munk Senior Fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, where he leads our program on intellectual property and innovation policy. Richard is one of Canada's most accomplished IP lawyers. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, where he has taught for over 20 years, and where he has served as executive director of the university's Center for Innovation, Law, and Policy. Richard's going to take 5 minutes to touch on a few issues related to NAFTA and IP and Canada's interest in those issues. Richard.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to share the stage with Dr. Boustany and to represent MLI and Action for Trade. To start with, what Josh said about the United States is true of Canada. We are very much increasingly driven by the creative energies of our citizens, and we would do well to keep that in mind as we work on the intellectual property provisions of the treaties that are going to increasingly govern our trade. I hope, in fact, that NAFTA negotiations will improve Canada's intellectual property laws. Even if that were to mean agreeing with the Americans, I think we can do that. Treaty negotiations are actually an opportunity for Canada to demonstrate its commitment to innovation, but yet we tend to be dragged along doing the minimum that we can, or the minimum that we have to, as we conclude treaties. You know, we have $15 billion in copyright services exports, and that's in a significant surplus position. $23 billion in technology trade, only $450 million of which is the deficit. Trade of this size doesn't happen anyway, contrary to what Canadian intellectual property commentators will tell you. We need strong intellectual property laws if trade in property is going to happen. Strong intellectual property rights improve trade. Studies show that countries with stronger intellectual property rights trade more, and they trade more with one another. Shared intellectual property rules, shared property rules, become a kind of connective tissue that facilitates trade. Moreover, strong intellectual property rights strongly improve foreign direct investment, which is so important to Canada's economy, an economy which I think most of us understand is made up primarily of small to medium-sized enterprises, particularly in the technology sphere. And you know, strong intellectual property rights are an important underpinning for allowing those smaller enterprises to deal with bigger ones, to facilitate going public, or indeed licensing or acquisition transactions with bigger companies, many of which are south of the border. I guess it's that way. And this important underpinning for the smaller companies is something I saw in my practice when I was in practice. I no longer am practicing law, and strongly supported by theory and empirical research. So, in short, intellectual property rights harmonization is properly the subject of trade negotiation, and strong rights are very much to Canada's benefit. In that regard, it was somewhat horrifying to see that we couldn't actually own up to the relatively modest intellectual property protections of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I gather a new deal has been struck, and I look forward to seeing what's in it. But I certainly hope that the government has seen the light about what really were fairly modest intellectual property protections in that agreement, in spite, again, of what commentators have said. We had better get off the U.S. Special 301 report of IP malefactors. Canada has long been on the list of countries which don't have adequate intellectual property protection from the U.S. perspective. There are some good reasons for that. And we had better not spark intellectual property disputes such as Eli Lilly's suit under NAFTA of Canada for $500 million for the invalidation of several of its patents. These kinds of headlines simply don't do much good from a trade perspective. It's amazing how much difference it makes that businessmen from south of the border see these kind of aspersions on the Canadian personality. Courts in Canada, thankfully, are beginning to fix some of the worst of our intellectual property problems. We have done away with the promise doctrine, which was the cause of the invalidation of Eli Lilly's patents. I won't even begin to explain what that is, but I can answer questions about it if you like. And we have reined in some of the worst excesses of our fair dealing doctrine, thanks to the federal court. And we're beginning to see lawsuits proceed against illegal downloaders and pirates in Canada. So we're improving, and the reasons that we were on the Special 301 report of IP malefactors are diminishing, but not gone. On the other hand, the government is proposing changes to the regulations that govern the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, which will result in lower prices for patented medicines in Canada, and thereby lower access to drugs in Canada, worse treatment, and a strong backsliding on our innovation agenda. So at a time when we should be increasing patent restoration and extending data protection for pharmaceuticals in Canada. They're very much an innovation-driven industry, and one that this country needs to better foster. In addition, there are continued irritants, such as notice and notice, which is this very odd provision that we have under our Copyright Act, which requires pirates and those posting infringing materials to be given notice that they've done so, but not for anything to happen, such as taking down that material. We have insufficient action against piracy in this country, and we also need to extend our copyright term to 70 years plus the life of the author, not only because it's a thing to do for our creators, but also because it will gain us the benefit of reciprocal protection in jurisdictions like Europe, which won't give that to Canadian authors unless we also extend it to European authors in our country. So in closing, intellectual property is very much the wrong issue for Canada to dig its heels in on. We're cutting off our nose to spite our face and puzzle our trading partners. And I think we can do better, and I think we need to have much greater confidence in our country as an innovation engine. Back to Brian. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Very stimulating remarks. It's now my pleasure to introduce our third speaker this evening, Dr. Charles Boustany. Now, I have to say every one of the people sitting up here is a star, but none of these stars burns more brightly than Dr. Boustany. Our keynote speaker this evening, he's a former congressman. Dr. Boustany served for 12 years in the U.S. House of Representatives as a Republican representing a coastal Louisiana district, including the city of Lafayette. That's Cajun country, for those of you who know Les Acadiens. As a retired thoracic and cardiovascular surgeon, Dr. Boustany brought his medical expertise to bear on healthcare policy. He co-founded the House Doctors Caucus and served on the influential House Ways and Means Committee, which has jurisdiction over healthcare, tax, and trade issues. I'm sure everyone here will be most interested to hear what his long experience on the front lines of medical care can tell us about the impact of innovation in the healthcare field on people's lives. Dr. Boustany.
Thank you, Brian. Well, Brian, thank you for that very, very kind introduction. And those stars that burn bright, they burn out too. I want to thank you and the Institute, along with Action for Trade, for making this event possible. And Richard, really great to meet you and have a conversation we had before. It's an honor to be on the stage with all three of you and to be a part of this. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been more than 30 years since our countries began hammering out what would eventually become the North American Free Trade Agreement, and nearly 25 years since it took effect. And we all know how much the world has changed since that time. This week's negotiations are certainly a reflection of the level of change that's occurred. Back then, the real debate was about tariffs and free movement of goods and services across borders. The architects of that accord had a laudable goal, and that was the creation of a more vibrant, competitive market for products like cars and textiles and agricultural products. These architects recognized that more broadly sharing the fruits of one's labor, and oftentimes fruit too, I might add, would create new opportunities across North America. From Cancun to Calgary, Mexico City to Montreal, they recognized that freer trade would boost prosperity for everyone. And that was an admirable vision then, and it's certainly an admirable vision now. But the global economy has changed. The free exchange of automobiles and avocados, while important, those issues are not the most pressing issues today. Because so much of what we create and sell cannot be loaded into an 18-wheeler or transported by freight or sea. The economy now depends on intellectual property, the ideas that result in life-saving medicines and medical technology, the knowledge that develops ingenious lines of code, the content of a Hollywood blockbuster or a best-selling album. In the United States alone, these intangible assets are behind more than half of all exports and support 2 in every 5 jobs. They create wealth, they expand prosperity, and boost economic growth. And they can be accessed, copied, sent around the world with the stroke of a key. The world has changed. Policymakers and trade negotiators who worked on NAFTA in the 1980s and 90s couldn't have really envisaged this new economy, and that's why the previous era's trade policies simply won't work. Let me be clear. I spent my entire political career promoting economic collaboration, and helping to open foreign markets. And I believe that open and international exchange of goods, services, and ideas is as essential as ever in our way of life for all of our countries. But the risk involved in trade deals have changed considerably over the past few decades. Today, we need trade solutions that do more than just open up markets. We need to make sure that innovators are rewarded for that work that they do, and that creative assets are truly protected. In short, we need trade agreements that put strong, enforceable intellectual property protections front and center. That's how we build an open, knowledge-based economy where ingenuity can flourish and everybody can ultimately benefit. This week, negotiators from Canada, Mexico, and the United States have an historic opportunity to bring trade policy into the 21st century, and I hope they keep that in mind. You may be asking yourself, why does a retired congressman feel so passionately about creativity and innovation and the IP protections that both of these things require? The truth is, I actually cared about these issues long before I even considered a run for office. Before coming to Congress in 2005, I spent a quarter of a century in medicine, ultimately as a heart surgeon. And it was a remarkable time to be a doctor. I witnessed amazing advances that revolutionized the way we treat patients. Sometimes it seemed like these advances were coming every day, and they seemed like they were commonplace, and it was just automatic. Let me give you an example. When I started medical school in 1978, it was one of the most common operations that general surgeons did was to remove a third or even half of the stomach through a big incision because of ulcers, peptic ulcers, something so many people have that went, and you really didn't have a good way to treat it other than some mild antacids. And patients had all these complications from it. It was just a mess. It was a very common operation. And then suddenly, a few years into my surgery residency, not long after I'd started at medical school, this drug came along called Tagamet, and it was a miracle drug. It was something you could take orally or intravenously, and it basically put an end, for the most part, to that horrible surgery that so many people ended up having to have with the complications. It was incredibly effective. Now, that drug you can buy it over the counter at a fraction of the cost of what it was, in dollars, in terms of dollars of the day. And it made a huge difference in the lives of millions of people, not only in America, but around the world. And it's rare to see an operation of the magnitude that was done routinely every day, multiple times a day, for peptic ulcer disease. I saw the same thing happen. And now, of course, with this drug, there are so many new generations of drugs to treat different types of these kinds of problems. But I saw the same thing happen again in cardiac surgery, my field. Back then we had to split the chest open and do all this horrible stuff, stop the heart. Advances in medicine now allow us to tailor treatment to patients. The advent of stenting, for instance, just inserting a catheter and unclogging an artery with a stent has made a difference in so many lives and allowed people to avoid this open heart surgery. And thanks to the latest medical devices, now you can actually replace an aortic valve through catheter technology. And this technology is becoming available worldwide. It's been fascinating to watch the advent of all this. But think about the benefit for those families and their loved one facing the specter of open heart surgery. And now they don't have to do that anymore in many cases. It's quite astounding. Over the course of my medical career, I watched as the United States became the hub for innovative heart procedures and treatments, attracting medical talent from all over the world. In many medical centers, you have doctors from all over who come to train to learn these techniques, and then they go back to their countries and offer better treatment for people in their own countries. The prospects for patients suffering from heart conditions has never been brighter, and these prospects continue to improve. This medical renaissance was a direct result of tireless research and development from the globe's leading scientists. Many were Americans. Yes, that's why this is a personal issue. I saw my field change, and I saw the benefit we could provide for people who really had no hope before. Now, I don't want to see my country lose its edge in research and development and medical discovery. Not just a matter of national pride. This is way beyond national pride, but because I've seen how this technological innovation can take the guesswork out of medicine and how it can transform life-threatening afflictions into treatable conditions, oftentimes curable conditions, and how we can save lives and prevent needless suffering. That's what's at stake in this debate on IP protection. You think about IP protection, okay? It's legalese, it's tough, it's hard stuff to understand, it's technical. It matters, and it matters to each of us and our families. And that's why I refuse to accept policies that take innovation for granted. Now, as you might imagine, it was a tremendous privilege to defend these beliefs as a member of the United States House of Representatives, particularly in my time serving on the Trade Subcommittee, where I worked on a number of trading agreements, including the Trans-Pacific Partnership. In fact, I was one of the co-founders of the TPP Caucus. And it was also during those years that I worked very hard to pass the U.S. South Korea Free Trade Agreement, CORUS. That accord vastly strengthened IP protections. It bolstered enforcement. It lengthened terms of copyrights. But it was far from perfect. But it marked an important victory in the fight to hold our trading partners to higher standards. But as the U.S. administration reviews CORUS, which they're starting to do, we should urge them to enforce all these provisions, and especially those including properly valuing innovation. This is a critically important issue. It's not just about protecting intellectual property, it's protecting the value of it as well. The need for modernizing our trade policies has only grown more urgent. Like it or not, the economy is global, and trust me, we're having that argument in the U.S. right now about whether we're in a global economy or not, and whether we really are interdependent. I believe we are. Knowledge, ideas, creative assets have never been more central to prosperity, and this is especially true in the United States. To take one example, let's look at the biopharmaceutical sector, which I talked a little bit about earlier. I already mentioned the indispensable role the industry plays in spurring medical progress, but let's take the year 2016 alone, one single year. These firms collectively invested $65 billion in the United States researching new treatments. This economic impact is gigantic. Pharmaceutical companies generated over $1.3 trillion in economic output in 2016. It's 1 year of output. Numbers this large are really hard to get your arms around or to really understand, but so let's talk about jobs. What about jobs? In the United States, IP-intensive manufacturing industries, not just the pharmaceutical firms, but also chip makers, aerospace companies, personal electronics makers, and more, supported nearly 60 million jobs. And when you add it all up, nearly 40% of American workers owe their jobs to an industry that's built on intangible, creative assets. And that number is only going to grow larger because innovation and creative companies are creating jobs at a faster clip than virtually anybody else. That's why it's important that the proper protections are put in place. America's most innovative industries are also some of the most prolific exporters. Again, let's look at the pharmaceutical industry. In 2016, the industry exported $52 billion in medicines. This is American pharmaceutical companies exporting $52 billion in medicine. More than 10% of these exports went to Canada and Mexico. And as the health system in Mexico improves, I expect those exports to grow. Ideally, the export of cutting-edge medicines could help illustrate how everyone benefits from free trade. There's a clear linkage. American firms gain new markets for products and the innovation that they bring to the market, while citizens in Canada and Mexico and elsewhere benefit from these new medicines and treatments. None of these benefits would be possible without patents, copyrights, trademarks, trade secrets, and other IP protections. These protections reward the hard work of generating new ideas experimenting with new solutions, and bringing something unprecedented and valuable to the marketplace. When innovators have no assurance that their creations will be properly valued and protected, the entire system is threatened. This entire ecosystem is threatened. And that's not just hyperbole. Incentives to invest in new products and ideas subside. Far-off markets lose access to the best products and technologies. Global economic growth will suffer, and jobs will be lost. That's the threat that's there today. And it's one that did not exist when NAFTA was originally drafted. The hard truth is that our trilateral pact, invaluable as it is, reflects the priorities of a different era, a different economy, a different century. Yet I remain hopeful, because this week our countries have a chance to do something about it, to strengthen IP protections, to lay the groundwork for future trade deals that are suited to the challenges of the information age. And what should these standards look like? For one, they should place a premium on transparency, consistency, and due process in how IP protections are formulated and enforced. Innovators need to know their creations will be protected before entering the market, and they deserve a say in how those protections are crafted. Any satisfactory system of IP standards should also provide clear, dependable mechanisms for ensuring creative assets are fairly valued by foreign markets. Price controls and other non-tariff barriers only suppress innovation. They also go against basic principles of free and fair exchange on which trade pacts are built. None of these standards will amount to much unless we enforce them, of course. IP violators need to face real penalties for their theft, no matter whether they're selling counterfeit wristwatches, pirating Hollywood films, or knocking off patent-protected medicines. It's the only way free trade can work for everyone in a knowledge economy. Foreign governments must be willing to crack down on IP infringers. If they're unwilling to do so, they don't deserve the creations of genuine innovators. That's how serious this is, because it is a serious threat. This is the kind of trade policy that our current moment demands. And right now, right here in Montreal, trade officials can make that policy a reality. I know the American people support these changes. You saw the polling information that Josh presented earlier. And I won't go back through some of that, but it's right there, I think, on the charts and on the paper you have in front of you. Let me just say that this support makes sense. Innovation depends on supporting and safeguarding IP. This week's negotiations are about far more than the North American Free Trade Agreement and American commerce. This is a chance to truly set new standards on how IP is treated in the global economy. Opportunities like this don't come along very often. And at a time when there are a lot of cross currents going against the promotion of trade and the free exchange of ideas, goods, service, intellectual property, the safeguards are absolutely necessary to ensure that we have a free trade system that we can all be proud of. A better NAFTA is a very important beginning that will unlock an era of global prosperity and innovation. The time is now. I hope our negotiators get this done. We need to put the pressure on them to make it happen and not give up on this and not let up on it. Thank you for having me tonight, and I look forward to answering questions.
Here. Well done.
As soon as we have the mic going, lovely. First of all, let me, on your behalf, thank all three of our speakers this evening, who I think have done yeoman service and put a number of very important issues on the table, which I know some of you involved in the negotiations here this week will take back to your various negotiating teams. So we have, I would say, roughly 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A, and I would like to invite people in the room to raise their hand and indicate if they have questions they would like to ask. Please, would you identify yourself? And actually, I think we could, do we have another handheld mic? No? Okay. Then I'm going to come down.
Yeah, my name's Chris Ward, and I guess my question is to the Canadian experts in the room. For the better part of a decade now, since 2011, Canada has had in place a immigration policy to encourage and support high-level foreign students through a fast track to immigration, the intent being to boost science and technology segments within our economy and within our country. I've never really seen anybody make the link between the tremendous inconsistencies in weak IP protection that exists in this country and an immigration policy that's intended to boost science and technology without any support for the creativity that would be expected from that fast track to immigration. And I'd like to get a response from MLI or from any other.
Richard, would you like to speak to that?
Sure. I mean, I think the response is fairly straightforward. Canada mixes its policies and isn't really sure about innovation. It will implement immigration policies such as you describe on the one hand, but then be rather tepid about intellectual property policy on the other. We're simply not consistent. If there's one thing that I admire about the United States in this context, it is that they are entirely consistent, that they do have strong incentives for innovation and believe in the wealth-creating effects of innovation. Canada, as I suggested by way of alluding to the weaknesses in our intellectual property policy, by way of the new provisions that are suggested for the Patented Medicines Prices Review Board, just wants it both ways. Wants easy access, wants lower prices, wants to be a user country instead of a creator country, and at the same time, we have all this federal government money flowing into innovation in all kinds of ways that's undercut by these other policies. So I say to Canada, it's time to be consistent. It's time to say we can do it. We can be an innovator country and rely on stronger rights. It's also important that you raise immigration in the context of NAFTA because, of course, one of the key protections of NAFTA is the flow of the immigration ability for experts in technology to flow across to move across the border to service their products in ways that are made much easier by the treaty. It would be awful to lose that. The importance of intellectual property, the importance of innovation that Dr. Boustany so clearly highlighted, it's just an increasingly important part of our trade. And if we don't allow that flow of expertise that has to go with the transfer of products across the border, we're going to be much worse off. And I hope that our trade negotiators are very much paying attention to that.
Either of you wish to weigh in? Good. Next question, yes.
Thank you. My name is Isolde Gendreau. I'm professor of intellectual property law at the University of Montreal. My question is for the entire panel. And because of the differences in the environment in which NAFTA negotiations are taking place, the NAFTA chapter was negotiated pretty much at the same time as the TRIPS chapter. So we can see that there's some sort of synergy between an international negotiation and a more regional negotiation. There doesn't seem to be this kind of dynamics this time, and I wonder to what extent this may have an impact on the success of a regional negotiation, in your opinion. Thank you.
Who would like to take that on? Your mic,
I forgot I have my
straight in.
mic here. Yeah. No, that's an important question because there was a synergy, I believe, back then. And right now we're dealing with lack of synergy And we've seen a sea change with the new administration, obviously, and its approach to trade policy. That's going to play out, and we're seeing it play out now in the context of NAFTA negotiations. I would say last March or April, I was speaking at an event on trade policy. And back then, we had a lot of the rhetoric coming from the U.S. Administration as to how they were going to approach trade. There was the early discussion about Section 232 investigations on steel, aluminum, looking at IP infringement looking at the tools to go after China and things of that nature. But there was really no action at that point in time. It was all largely discussion, talk, investigations. NAFTA, the negotiations going on right now are really the true test of the American administration today as to how this is going to play out. What approach are they really going to take? Or some of these provisions or ideas they put on the table, is it negotiating bluff, or is it a real position? And are the threats to pull out real? A lot of people think they are, but we'll have to see what happens. So there's that lack of synergy. The other thing is these issues have become much more complicated on the global stage, and in the U.S. there's this perception that the WTO is not working to deal with it. Yet at the same time, the U.S. has taken a position not to strengthen or offer kinds of reforms necessary for the WTO. So I don't know. The game's got to play out. I think right now it's focused on NAFTA, and I think that's going to be the test of what this administration in the U.S. and how they're going to handle these issues play out. But I do agree with you that there is this lack of synergy that's ongoing. And you may want to give the Canadian point of view, or Josh.
Josh, I think it's a great question. And it highlights how times change. I would say there are two major impacts of the passage of time since TRIPS. One is there's less of a culture of internationalism, as Dr. Boustany clearly alludes to, particularly south of the border, it seems. The other is it puts Canada in a different position. When we are negotiating with the rest of the world, we have a much more balanced reality of being both producer and consumer of intellectual property vis-a-vis the other countries. When we're looking at the United States, we not only have a small, albeit negative, balance of trade in cultural goods with the United States. It's a small deficit, but it's there. But dare I say it, some inherent sense of inferiority that makes us question the negotiating position of the United States, even though it's in our best interests to strengthen intellectual property rights. So I suspect a PhD thesis could be written in answer to your question, but those two factors are the ones that I'd highlight.
Sure, I'd just say, I think it's a great point that obviously the environment in which the negotiations are conducted has an impact on the final result. The point that TRIPS were being negotiated at the time that the original NAFTA was being negotiated put pressure to raise the standards within the intellectual property chapter in the first negotiation. I think the environment for the current modernization talks has had an interesting effect. You see Canada continuing to reach out to other negotiating partners, Mexico continuing to reach out to other negotiating partners. I think what's important from an action for trade perspective is that the NAFTA modernization talks are an opportunity to set a high-level standard for those other negotiations, whether they be that the talks that the United States are engaged in or talks that Mexico and Canada are engaged in independently with other parties.
Other questions from the audience? Yes.
My name is Brian Daly, and I'm an intellectual property lawyer with Norton Rose Fulbright here in Montreal. I was interested in your remarks because I thought when you were saying them about two things. One, TPP, As I understood it, and I'm not an expert on TPP, one of the big benefits of TPP for the United States would be increased respect for intellectual property, especially in Asia, which would have been of benefit to the United States. Yet, the United States walked away from TPP. What we hear in the public about NAFTA are that the following are the major stumbling blocks: 5-year sunset clause, content requirements for the automotive industry, and subsidies for the agricultural industry in the form of supply management in Canada, which sound an awful lot like the issues that were at play when NAFTA was first negotiated 30 years ago. So why isn't IP of greater importance, at least in what we're hearing publicly, in terms of the current negotiations?
I think one of the reasons that that's occurred is that you can look at this in terms of 3 baskets of issues that need to be negotiated. At the very basic level, you have a whole range of very technical issues that need to be worked out. And included in that, there would be some things that have already been largely agreed upon. Then you have some of the newer issues that need to be worked out at a very technical level, where there's disagreement and will take some time. Those aren't being addressed for the most part, because most of the oxygen is being sucked out of the air by some of these red line issues that the U.S. government, my government, has put on the table. The sunset clause, the country-specific content requirement, and the higher rules of origin, and you know, some of these other issues you mentioned. I think that's gotten most of the attention, and it's also been a source of friction among the negotiators, so that I think it's probably had an impact on these other issues that are more technical, where we have differences and they need to be worked out, IP being one of them. You know, I think the administration on the U.S. side went into this and said, well, we're going to put the TPP provisions on the table. Well, that was within a different context, and they assumed that would translate into the 3-party negotiation for NAFTA, and that's obviously not the case. So I think those are some of the reasons why you haven't heard as much about this as the other issues, the red line issues that have gotten all the press coverage.
I'd say your question nails it on the head as to why Action for Trade exists, right? These issues have traditionally been at the top of negotiating parties' lists. We are working to make sure that they have a high profile in this agreement, and that they reach a high standard agreement that allows countries to implement rules that protect and properly value intellectual property, whether that's patents, copyrights, et cetera. But also to say, while that may be the case, that the profile of these issues may not be as high at the start of this negotiation as it was in previous rounds, that as a result of that, we don't simply want to take some of the positions that may have been on the table in TPP or another agreement. We want to say, let's implement a high standard agreement. While there are a number of benefits to TPP, we had some very serious and strong concerns about the provisions that were included in the intellectual property chapter of that agreement, and so we want to continue to work towards new provisions that properly and fairly value IP in a new NAFTA.
No, I think it's been well addressed. I think these are certainly important issues for Canada, and I'm not sure that the government is as well directed on them as it might be, but there is perhaps greater profile and sensitivity on this side of the border than there is on the U.S. side.
Thank you. My name is Alfredo Tourné. I am anti-piracy campaign, music industry in Mexico. The question is, copyrights, related rights, since NAFTA and up to date has suffered big changes. Right now we're seeing digital environment, music, movies, etc. So when you have a renegotiation of NAFTA and you're putting these topics on the table. What should 3 countries do in order to protect this and not let the wording die in 5 years, 10 years, because we don't know where it's going. So if you're going to renegotiate NAFTA in 20 more years, I mean, the protection for copyrights or related rights in the digital environment will be obsolete. So what is a fair negotiation and wording in NAFTA in order to avoid this chapter to be obsolete in 5 or 6 or 7 years?
I think that's a great question, especially when it comes to a lot of the copyright issues that you're concerned about. Just as the technology has changed over the last 25 years since we first negotiated NAFTA, we need to be careful not to require countries to implement rules for technology that could be outdated in another 25 years, right? So we want to allow countries to implement rules that protect copyright creators and allow them to be able to defend their creative works, whether that's online or offline, and really give countries the tools that they need to protect that creative work. We know that when we protect it, we encourage the creation of more creative work, whether that's music, movies, television, the written word, and those are the kinds of high-level protections that we'd like to see out of a new NAFTA.
That's such a good question. I feel like I should charge a fee for answering it. And since I can't, I won't feel too embarrassed by the generality of my answer, which is, I think it's an extremely difficult question. The bipartite answer I'd give is one, principles as opposed to focusing on particular technologies. Our copyright, I beg your pardon, our copyright treaties have survived many decades with occasional updating, but nonetheless, they've worked very well. That's true of the general principles of the copyright acts of all of our countries as well. So I would say, let's not talk about the ability of particular telecom companies to delist pirate websites, which has finally come up in this country, by the way, and which is something we desperately need to address. But let's talk about the importance of interdicting pirate materials in general and of adapting our laws periodically as a means to do that. The second part of my answer would simply be, I don't know that it's possible to come up with particular wording which is going to work in the treaty other than wording which requires periodic revisiting. And the U.S. has put that on the table, a five-year sunset clause. Given the subject we're here talking about, technology and intellectual property, I'm not sure that that's a bad idea. We would do well to continue to iterate and supplely manipulate the rules for the changes in technology, which are only going to be, well, who knows, right? We can't really anticipate them.
I think that's the key, is building out the principles based on what we know about technology today. Who can foresee what's coming next? And so there has to be something built in to account for adjustments with new technology. I mean, you think about intellectual property theft and how that's changed, now with the internet. You have individuals operating anywhere that can steal stuff online, and it's very difficult to track. I think in terms of principles, there's got to be a commitment among nation states that they're going to step up with law and enforcement mechanisms to the best of ability. There's got to be that agreement, because if that's not there, then, we're going to deal with an anarchic system, and a lot of intellectual property is going to be stolen over time. So you build off of principles, you try to adapt to the circumstances of technology of the day, and create enough flexibility to revisit these issues. I don't like the idea of a sunset clause because I think it creates too much uncertainty going forward, but I think what you want is, some kind of flexibility in terms of review in areas that are changing quickly. That's got to be the way to deal with it. But the fundamental problem is, getting nation states to agree that there's a problem within their borders and collaboration on enforcement to crack down on the infringers. That's got to be the case, and that's not the case around the world today, as we all know, with certain countries.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, let me thank you all once again for being here, and let me ask you to join me in thanking our panelists, Richard Owen, Charles Boustany, and of course Josh Teitelbaum from Action for Trade for their comments this evening. I think they've given terrific context to the NAFTA negotiations which are going on, and again I want to thank Action for Trade and Josh for sponsoring this evening's event, and thanks to Canadian American Business Council and Scotty Greenwood for helping spread the word and fill this room. Thanks also to obviously the Queen Elizabeth Hotel for a terrific venue, and thanks to the MLI team, Amber, Allison, Mick, George, who have worked so hard to ensure the success of this event. We hope that you will join us in the future as we will be hosting more of the top experts with the best ideas for better public policy. And on that note, if you can be in Ottawa in mid-February, hey, we came to Montreal in January, you can make it to Ottawa in mid-February, you really should check out our annual dinner planned for February 13th at the War Museum. The theme of that evening is the future of Canada-US relations, and we're very excited that we have a former colleague of Charles Boustany's, Pete Sessions, from Texas, who will be delivering a keynote address. We will also have, in one of her first public appearances, the new U.S. Ambassador to Canada, Kelly Craft, will be on the program, as well as Frank Buckley, who is a Canadian living in the United States. He's a speechwriter for President Donald Trump, and many other people who will have a lot to say about these important issues. We've created the event of 2018, bringing the best and the brightest from both sides of the border to chart a course for the future of Canada-US relations. I hope some of you may be able to make it. Thanks once again for coming this evening. We hope to see you at an MLI event soon. Please remain. We've got another 10-15 minutes of reception, and our guest speakers will stay and mingle with the crowd and help to answer any further questions you may have. Thank you and good night.